Riverside wasn't the place I pictured ending up when I left the city. Back then, I had plans, big ones, before everything fell apart. I thought I'd be a lifer on the force, maybe make detective captain one day. But that was before the operation went bad, before the fallout, before Tom died in the rain, bleeding out on cracked pavement while I watched, helpless. That was 2 years ago. I haven't worn a badge since. Instead, I spend my days installing security systems in homes and businesses around this sleepy town, passing the time in quiet routine. Riverside is a place where no one asks too many questions, which suits me fine. I like it that way. At least, that's what I tell myself. On most nights, I sit in my one-bedroom bungalow, listening to the hum of crickets and the murmur of the river that winds through the edge of town. It's the kind of place where the air smells like pine and distant rain, and where the silence has a way of seeping into your bones. But sometimes, when the wind picks up, I think I hear the echo of gunshots, see flashes of blue and red lights in the corner of my eye. I remind myself it's just memory playing tricks, and I try not to think about the past. It was late when Rachel showed up on my doorstep, soaked to the bone from the rain that had started just after dusk. Her hair clung to her face, and she looked smaller than I remembered, hollowed out like she'd been carrying a weight too heavy for too long. I hadn't seen her since Tom's funeral, and even then, our words had been stiff and distant, like we didn't know how to bridge the gap between us. She stood there, shivering in the rain, clutching a waterlogged envelope against her chest. "David, I need your help," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's about Tom." The sound of his name was like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. I hadn't asked her to come, but I stepped aside and let her in, watching as she glanced around my sparse living room like she was seeing a ghost. I wondered what she saw in me now, if she saw the man who'd failed her husband or just another shadow of the past. She dropped into the armchair by the window, her hands shaking as she opened the envelope. Inside were a handful of printed notes, the words typed in block letters with no signature. The first one read, "He didn't die the way you think. Look closer." Another said, "You're not safe. He had secrets you never knew." I skimmed the notes, feeling a familiar unease settle in my gut. "Rachel, what is this? Where did these come from?" She wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "I don't know. They started showing up last week, left in my mailbox, under my door. At first, I thought it was some kind of sick joke, but then I found this." She pulled out a worn Polaroid, passing it to me. It showed a grainy image of Tom, alive, tense, speaking to a man I didn't recognize. It looked like it was taken on a street corner somewhere in the city, the same block where he died. I studied the image, my pulse quickening. "Rachel, you know these could be fake, right? Someone trying to mess with you." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Maybe, but what if they're not? What if someone knows something about Tom's death, something they're trying to tell me?" I closed my eyes, trying to steady the rush of memories. The last time I saw Tom, we were both crouched behind an overturned car, rain pouring down around us, waiting for backup that never came. He'd given me a look, something between a smile and a grimace, and said, "It'll be fine, partner. Just keep your head down." Then the gunfire started, and nothing was ever fine again. I tossed the notes onto the coffee table, leaning back against the wall. "Look, Rachel, I get that this is hard for you, but digging up the past, it's not going to change anything. Tom's gone." She flinched at my words, her expression hardening. "Don't you think I know that? But whoever's sending these, they know things, David. They know details about the operation, about you, about me, things they shouldn't know." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What do you mean, about me?" Rachel bit her lip, glancing toward the envelope again. "One of the notes, it mentioned you. It said, 'David knows more than he thinks. Ask him about the night it happened.'" The words sent a jolt through me, bringing back memories I'd tried to bury. It was true that the night Tom died still didn't make sense. The way the backup never arrived, the way our intel turned out to be so catastrophically wrong. But I told myself it was a series of bad decisions, nothing more. I told myself I could move on if I stopped asking questions. But now, with Rachel staring at me, waiting for an answer I didn't have, the old doubts clawed their way back to the surface. I looked at the notes again, this time more closely. Whoever had sent them knew about the operation in detail, details that had never made it into the reports. My first thought was that it might be a former cop, someone with a grudge. But the phrasing was too personal, too direct. It felt like a message meant just for us. "All right," I said finally, crossing my arms. "I'll help you look into this. But I'm telling you now, Rachel, if we start pulling at this thread, we might not like what we find." She nodded, her relief almost palpable. "Thank you, David. I know you're risking a lot by helping me." I shrugged, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. "Let's just start with what we have. Maybe there's a way to trace these notes, find out where they came from." Rachel stayed a little longer, going over the notes with me. But as the rain picked up outside, I could tell she was anxious to leave. She slipped out into the night without saying goodbye, disappearing down the same road she'd driven in on. I watched her go, then stood on the porch for a long time, staring out at the rain-soaked streets. I thought about Tom, about the way he'd looked that night, blood soaking his jacket, his voice already fading as he tried to tell me something I couldn't quite hear. I'd spent 2 years trying to forget that moment, trying to convince myself that his death had been a simple tragedy. But now, with those notes burning in my pocket, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't felt in a long time, doubt. And I couldn't ignore the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I'd missed something crucial. I thought I'd sleep that night, but it wasn't meant to be. When I went out to my car the next morning, I found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the windshield wiper, the edges damp from the rain. My heart hammered in my chest as I unfolded it, the words striking me like a blow. "You should have known better, David. Secrets never stay buried." I stared at the note, my pulse roaring in my ears. Someone was watching, someone who knew about Tom, about the investigation about me. And they wanted me to dig, to find whatever they'd buried in the shadows of the past. I crumpled the note in my hand, feeling the weight of a choice I hadn't wanted to make. I glanced back toward the house, where the remnants of my quiet life waited. But I already knew that there was no turning back now. The morning after finding the note on my car, I met Rachel at the Hollow Bean, a diner on the outskirts of Riverside. It was one of those places where the coffee tasted like dishwater, but the booths offered privacy, and the waitstaff knew when to keep their distance. Rachel sat in the back corner, cradling a mug between her hands, staring out the window as the rain drummed steadily against the glass. I slid into the booth across from her, pulling the crumpled note from my jacket pocket. "Found this on my car this morning. Any idea what it means?" Her hands went still around the mug as she read the note, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "David, they know you're helping me. They're trying to scare you off." I leaned back, keeping my voice even. "It's working, but I'm not walking away. Not yet." She looked at me, relief softening her features, but I couldn't ignore the nagging doubt that had taken root in my mind. She hadn't even asked who they might be, like she already had an idea. But I let it slide for now. There were bigger questions that needed answering. Rachel handed over the other notes she'd received, and I spent the next few hours poring over them, looking for any patterns or clues that might lead us to the sender. The notes were all typed, with no fingerprints or traces of handwriting. They referenced details from the operation, like the location of the stakeout, the names of the suspects we'd been monitoring, things that only someone on the inside would know. One note stood out, a message that mentioned a place called Oak Ridge. "What's this?" I asked, pointing to the name. Rachel hesitated, chewing her lip. It's where Tom went a few times before he died. He never told me what he was doing there, just said it was work-related. I always thought it was just a place he went to clear his head. I frowned, trying to remember if Tom had ever mentioned Oak Ridge to me. But the name didn't ring any bells. It was a stretch of abandoned buildings and overgrown woods about 20 miles outside of Riverside. Perfect for meeting someone you didn't want anyone to know about. "You think he might have stashed something out there?" I asked. "Maybe," Rachel said quietly. "But I didn't want to go alone." I nodded, folding the note and slipping it back into my pocket. "Fine, we'll check it out. But if this turns out to be a wild goose chase?" She nodded, but she didn't finish the thought. And neither did I. Before heading to Oak Ridge, I made a call to Mason, the one guy who still owed me a favor. He picked up after a few rings, his voice gruff, and wary. David, haven't heard from you in a while. You finally decide to crawl out from under your rock. I ignored the jab. Need some info on a place called Oak Ridge. And any chatter about a guy named Tom Morgan, just before he died. There was a pause, then the sound of a lighter clicking. That name still gets under your skin, huh? I'll see what I can dig up. But if you're messing with the past, you should know better. Some doors are better left closed. Just give me what you can, Mason, I said, my jaw tight. I'll owe you one. He let out a low chuckle. You already owe me a dozen, but I'll take it. I'll call you back. I ended the call, feeling a familiar sense of unease settle in my gut. If Mason was this cagey, it meant whatever he found wouldn't be good news. But I needed answers, even if they were ones I didn't want to hear. Rachel and I drove out to Oak Ridge that afternoon. The road twisted through dense trees, the asphalt cracked and pitted from years of neglect. By the time we reached the old parking lot, the sky had darkened with storm clouds, casting deep shadows across the overgrown lot. We stepped out of the car, and I scanned the area, noting the way the woods pressed in on all sides, the silence thick and heavy. Rachel clutched her jacket tighter around herself, looking like she wanted to disappear into it. Where do we start? She asked, her voice barely carrying over the wind. I nodded toward a dilapidated building at the edge of the lot, a place that might have been a storage shed once, long before nature started reclaiming it. Let's try there. We pushed through the door, the hinges groaning in protest, and found a small room littered with debris. But in the back corner, hidden beneath a rotting tarp, I found a lockbox. It was old and rusted, but the lock was new, the kind you'd find at any hardware store. Rachel hovered behind me, watching as I forced the box open with a crowbar. Inside, I found a stack of papers, printouts of bank records, offshore account transfers, and surveillance photos. My pulse quickened as I flipped through them, recognizing the names of cartel fronts and money laundering operations we'd been investigating before the operation went bad. And then, tucked at the bottom of the stack, I found something that made my blood run cold. A photo of me and Tom, taken the night of the stakeout, just hours before he died. The angle was all wrong, too distant for any of our team to have taken it. I held it up to Rachel, my voice sharp. Where did you get this? Did Tom leave this here for you? She shook her head, looking genuinely bewildered. I swear, I've never seen that photo before. But, David, what does it mean? It means someone's been watching us for a long time, I muttered, slipping the photo into my pocket. And they're still out there. We left Oak Ridge with more questions than answers. But when we returned to Rachel's house, it was clear that we weren't the only ones searching for the truth. The front door had been forced open, the lock splintered, and inside, the living room was a mess. Cushions ripped, drawers overturned, books scattered across the floor. A message was scrawled on the wall in red paint, the letters dripping down like blood. Leave it alone, or you'll end up like Tom. Rachel stumbled back, pressing a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. I grabbed her shoulder, guiding her out onto the porch before she could break down completely. Rachel, listen to me. We need to go somewhere safe, somewhere they can't find us. She nodded, her face pale. But David, who are they? Why are they doing this? I thought about the offshore accounts, the surveillance photos, the messages that kept pulling us deeper into the shadows of Tom's past. And I knew that whoever was behind this wanted to keep something buried, something that Tom had uncovered before he died. We'll find out, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But first, we need to stay alive. That night, after settling Rachel in a motel on the edge of town, I went back through the papers we'd found in the lockbox. One name kept appearing in the bank records, Dario Castillo, a cartel informant I thought had vanished years ago. He'd been feeding us intel during the sting operation, but then he'd gone dark right before everything went south. I called Mason again, my voice tense. You find anything on Oak Ridge? Mason's voice was grim. Yeah, David, I found something. Turns out Tom wasn't the only one going out there. He met with a man named Dario, a guy who was supposed to be off the grid. And David, the word is Dario's still around. He's been keeping tabs on you. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Because I didn't want to get involved? Damn it. These people, they're dangerous, David. You dig too deep, they'll bury you. I hung up, my mind spinning with the implications. If Dario was still out there, then maybe he held the answers we needed. But the deeper I went, the more I wondered if I could trust anyone in this mess, including Rachel. As I stared out into the rainy night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And I knew that the game we'd started was only just beginning. We drove through the back roads of Riverside, heading toward a small town where Dario had reportedly been hiding out. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her face drawn with exhaustion. The sky was darkening, the last light fading behind the mountains, and the air felt heavy with a coming storm. I couldn't shake the weight of our discoveries at Oak Ridge. The photo of me and Tom, the bank records, the messages scrawled in red paint. All of it swirled in my mind like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. And then there was Rachel, sitting beside me, her silence growing thicker with every mile. I finally broke the quiet. Why didn't you tell me Tom was working with Dario? You must have known he was more than just some informant. She turned to me, her eyes shadowed in the fading light. I didn't know, David. I swear. Tom never told me what he was doing in those last months, just that he was trying to fix something he'd broken. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to keep my frustration in check. Well, whatever he was into, it's clear that he left a mess behind. And now we're the ones paying for it. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at the screen, Mason. I pulled over to the side of the road, the car's engine rumbling as I answered the call. David, you've got a serious problem, Mason said without preamble, his voice tense. I managed to track down some of those offshore account transfers. Turns out, Tom wasn't just funneling money for himself. He was paying someone off, and Rachel's name is on the withdrawal records. I felt my stomach drop, and I turned to look at Rachel, who was watching me with wary eyes. What the hell are you talking about, Mason? You heard me, he replied. There are deposits to an account under Rachel's maiden name, transferred right before Tom's death. It looks like hush money. A cold anger crept up my spine, and I held the phone tighter. Send me everything you have, Mason. And don't call me again unless you've got something useful. I ended the call and turned to Rachel, who was already shaking her head, her expression turning panicked. David, whatever Mason told you, it's not true. I didn't take any money from Tom. I held up a hand, cutting her off. Mason found the records, Rachel. You need to start telling me the truth. Now! Rachel's face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. I didn't ask for the money, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't even know about it until after he died. He must have set it up somehow, thinking it would keep me safe. But I never touched it, I swear. I studied her, trying to see past the tears, past the fear. But all I saw was the same uncertainty I'd seen in every lie, every evasion. If you're lying to me, Rachel, I'll leave you here. I'll go to Dario alone. She reached out, grabbing my arm, her grip tight and desperate. Please, David, you have to believe me. I've made mistakes, but I would never do something like that to Tom. I pulled away from her grasp, my mind spinning. I thought about turning back, leaving her here in the dark, but then I remembered the threats, the photos, the danger that seemed to follow us both wherever we went. I knew that if I left her, I'd be abandoning my only chance at getting to the bottom of this. All right, I said finally, turning back to the road. But if I find out you've been lying to me again, you're on your own. Understand? She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, and we drove on in silence, the tension between us as thick as the storm clouds overhead. We found Dario in a seedy bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions as long as you kept your head down. He was hunched over a table in the corner, a bottle of tequila in front of him, looking like he hadn't slept in days. When he saw me, his eyes widened with recognition, and he started to stand, but I waved him back down. You're a hard man to find, Dario, I said, sliding into the booth across from him. Rachel followed, sitting beside me, her expression wary. Dario's hand twitched toward his jacket pocket, but I shook my head. Don't even think about it. We're just here to talk. He let out a nervous laugh, glancing around the bar like he expected someone to come for him any second. You shouldn't have come, man. They're already watching you. Who's watching? I demanded, leaning closer. And why the hell are you sending us these threats? Dario shook his head, taking a swig from the bottle. Wasn't me. I've been trying to stay off their radar ever since things went bad with Tom. But I can tell you this much. Whoever's after you, they don't want the truth getting out. And what truth is that? Rachel asked, her voice sharp. Dario looked at her, his expression darkening. That Tom was playing both sides. He was working with the cartel, feeding them information to protect himself. But then he got greedy, started gathering evidence, trying to set himself up as the hero. That's when they decided to take him out. I felt a chill run through me, the pieces clicking into place. If what Dario was saying was true, then Tom's death hadn't been a random tragedy. It had been a planned execution, designed to keep him from turning on the people he'd been dealing with. Why should I believe anything you say? I asked, keeping my voice steady. You could be lying just like the rest of them. Dario's eyes flicked toward Rachel, then back to me, and he let out a hollow laugh. You think I'm the only one keeping secrets here? Ask her why Tom came to me in the first place. Ask her what he was trying to save. I turned to Rachel, my anger boiling over. What is he talking about, Rachel? What did Tom tell you? She opened her mouth, but no words came out, her expression stricken. Dario shook his head, leaning back in the booth. You think she's innocent? She's been working with him since the beginning, just like Tom. She knew he was in deep, and she's been trying to cover it up ever since. Rachel shot to her feet, her face flushed with anger. That's a lie, David. I didn't know he kept me in the dark until the end. I didn't want any of this. Dario shrugged, raising his hands in mock surrender. Believe what you want. But you should know, David, that the cartel has a way of finding out who's been poking around in their business. They don't leave loose ends. I stood up, pulling Rachel toward the door. We're done here, Dario. If you want to save your own skin, you'd better disappear. He called after us, his voice echoing through the dingy bar. It's too late for that, man. For all of us. We barely made it back to the car when the first gunshot rang out, splintering the window beside us. I pulled Rachel down, scrambling into the driver's seat as more shots echoed through the night. I slammed the gas pedal, the car fishtailing on the wet pavement as we tore out of the parking lot. Rachel clutched my arm, her breath coming in panicked gasps. David, we have to get out of here. They'll kill us if we stay. I kept my eyes on the road, my mind racing. Whoever was behind the attack, they wanted to tie up loose ends, and that meant they were closing in on us fast. But as I glanced at Rachel, I couldn't shake the suspicion that she'd known this was coming, that she'd been keeping more than just Tom's secrets from me. Don't worry, Rachel, I muttered, gripping the wheel. We're not done yet, but you're going to start telling me the truth, or we're both as good as dead. The car sped down the rain-soaked back roads, the engine straining as I pushed it harder than I should have. My mind was racing just as fast, replaying Dario's words over and over. She's been working with them since the beginning. Rachel sat beside me, her hands shaking as she clutched the torn seat cushion, her face turned away as if she couldn't bear to look at me. Tell me, Rachel, I demanded, the words sharp in the cramped space between us. How long have you known about Tom's dealings? About Dario? She shook her head, her voice coming out in a broken whisper. David, I told you I didn't know the full extent. I knew Tom was in over his head, but I thought he'd find a way out. I never knew it would come to this. I clenched my jaw, gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. That's not good enough. I need the truth, Rachel. All of it. Because right now, you're looking a hell of a lot like someone who's been playing me from the start. She turned to face me, her eyes wide with fear. And something else, something like desperation. David, please, you have to believe me. I love Tom. I thought he was trying to protect us, protect me. He kept so many secrets. But if I'd known what he was really doing, I would have tried to stop him. I kept my gaze on the road, trying to push down the conflicting emotions boiling inside me. The rain hammered against the windshield, the wipers barely keeping up with the downpour. Dario's words had planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't ignore, but the fear in Rachel's eyes, it looked real. And that made everything so much worse. We drove until we were sure no one had followed us, eventually pulling off into a secluded rest stop deep in the woods. The night pressed in on us, thick with shadows, and the rain soaked through our clothes as we stepped out into the cold. I turned to Rachel, my voice flat. We need to figure out what the hell is really going on here. Is there anything else you've been hiding from me? She hesitated, And then, with a shuddering breath, she reached in her bag and pulled out a small key. Tom. He gave me this a few weeks before he died. He told me to keep it safe, but I never knew what it was for. I think it might be connected to whatever he was hiding. I stared at the key, feeling a surge of frustration. And you're just telling me this now? I didn't think it mattered, she shot back, her voice cracking with a mixture of anger and fear. I didn't even know if it was connected to the notes. But if there's something in that safe, maybe it can help us figure out what Tom was trying to do. She described the location, a storage unit Tom had rented in secret just outside of Riverside. It was the kind of place where people stored the skeletons they didn't want anyone else to see. We got back in the car and drove in silence, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. By the time we reached the storage unit, the rain had let up, leaving the night air thick and cool. We found the unit at the back of the lot, hidden beneath a flickering security light. I watched as Rachel's hands shook while she unlocked the padlock, her breath coming out in short, visible puffs. The metal door rattled open, revealing a dimly lit space cluttered with old furniture and cardboard boxes. At the back of the unit, half buried beneath a tarp, was a small safe. I pulled the key from her hand and slid it into the lock, feeling the tumblers shift beneath my fingers. The door clicked open, revealing stacks of old manila envelopes, each one stuffed with documents and photographs. I grabbed the first envelope and tore it open, my hands trembling with anticipation. Inside, I found more bank records, detailed transactions from Tom's offshore accounts, along with notes about cartel fronts and encrypted communications. But then, buried at the bottom of the safe, I found something that stopped me cold. A photo of Rachel, standing beside a man with a tattoo I recognized immediately, the symbol of the cartel. It was dated 2 months before Tom's death. I turned the photo toward her, my voice low and dangerous. "What the hell is this, Rachel?" She blanched, backing away from me, her hands going up as if to ward off a blow. I can explain. It's not what it looks like." I took a step closer, feeling my pulse hammering in my ears. "It looks like you were working with the same people who killed Tom. Were you feeding them information? Was all of this just a setup to get me to find his stash?" Tears spilled down her cheeks, her voice cracking with desperation. "No, David, you have to listen. That man, his name is Marco. He approached me after Tom died, said he could help me if I cooperated. He told me that Tom owed the cartel, that they'd come after me if I didn't play along. I thought I could keep them off my back, but then they started asking about you, about what Tom might have told you." The anger burned hot in my chest, and I shoved the photo back in her hands. "So you lied to me, used me, just like you lied to Tom." She shook her head, stumbling over her words. "I was scared. I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could use you to figure out what Tom was hiding so I could bargain for my life. But I didn't want you to get hurt. I thought I could fix everything." I stared at her, feeling a wave of betrayal crash over me. "You've been playing both sides from the start, and you think that justifies dragging me into this mess?" Rachel's shoulders sagged, her face crumpling. "David, I'm so sorry, but you have to believe me. I never wanted it to go this far. I didn't see any other way." Before I could respond, the sound of tires crunching over gravel reached us. Headlights cut through the darkness, and I grabbed Rachel, dragging her behind the storage unit just as a black SUV rolled to a stop in front of the open door. Men stepped out, guns glinting in the faint light, their expressions cold and predatory. I cursed under my breath, keeping my hand on my gun as I counted the figures, 3, maybe 4. One of them barked out orders in Spanish, the words barely audible over the hum of the SUV's engine. I glanced at Rachel, her face pale with terror, and knew we didn't stand a chance in a straight fight. I pressed close to her, my voice barely a whisper. "Do you know who they are?" She nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "They're Marco's men. They must have followed us. David, we have to get out of here." I gritted my teeth, my mind racing. "Not yet. We need something to turn the tables. Is there anything in that safe we can use?" She glanced back toward the unit, her expression desperate. Maybe the phone logs. Tom had a list of calls he made right before the operation. If we can get them, It might prove that the cartel was planning something before he died. I nodded, steeling myself. All right, you keep watch. I'll grab the logs. I moved quickly, slipping back into the unit and rummaging through the papers until I found the logbook Rachel had mentioned. I could hear the men's voices growing louder outside, and I knew our time was running out. But as I grabbed the logs, my hand brushed against a small, unmarked flash drive hidden beneath the stack of documents. I pocketed it, not knowing what it contained, but hoping it might be the leverage we needed. Then I turned back to Rachel, ready to make our escape. But as I stepped out of the storage unit, one of the men spotted us. He raised his gun, shouting a warning, and the night erupted in a hail of bullets. I dove for cover, dragging Rachel with me as the shots peppered the metal walls. We returned fire, but the odds were against us, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the sharp cracks of gunfire. I caught a glimpse of Rachel's face, pale with terror, and I wondered if this was how it would end, gunned down in the dark, buried beneath the weight of secrets we'd never get the chance to reveal. But just as I thought all hope was lost, a new set of headlights swept into the lot, and another car roared in. I caught sight of Mason, leaning out the driver's window with a rifle in hand, and the gunfire shifted, turning toward him instead. Rachel and I used the distraction to make a break for it, scrambling toward Mason's car. As we piled into the back seat, I glanced at Rachel, seeing the fear and guilt in her eyes, and I knew that whatever came next, I couldn't afford to trust her or anyone else. Mason drove us through the winding back roads outside of Riverside, his jaw clenched tight as he kept glancing at the rearview mirror, watching for any sign that Marco's men had followed. Rachel slumped against the window, her breaths coming in short, uneven gasps. I kept my hand on the gun in my jacket, watching her through narrowed eyes. After everything we'd uncovered, her connection to the cartel, the offshore accounts, the money, I wasn't sure how much of her story I believed anymore. But for now, we had a bigger problem, staying alive long enough to make sense of the mess Tom had left behind. We reached Mason's cabin at the edge of the woods, just as dawn began to break over the mountains. It was a secluded place, surrounded by thick pines, the kind of spot where no one would find you unless they knew where to look. Mason killed the engine and turned to me, his face grim. "You two are damn lucky I showed up when I did," he muttered, his voice rough. "Now, you want to tell me what the hell you've gotten yourselves into?" I glanced at Rachel, who looked away, then handed Mason the logbook and the flash drive I'd found in the storage unit. Tom was into something deep with the cartel. We think this might be the key to figuring out what he was trying to do before he died. Mason raised an eyebrow, slipping the drive into his laptop. "Well, let's see if it's worth the trouble." As the flash drive loaded, a series of encrypted files appeared on the screen: emails, surveillance logs, and audio recordings. Mason started working on decrypting them, his fingers flying over the keys. I watched the screen, my pulse quickening with each new file that opened. One of the decrypted emails caught my eye, addressed from Tom to an unknown recipient, dated just a week before the operation. The subject line read, "Evidence, insurance policy." Tom's message was short, urgent. "I have the proof you wanted. The cartel's network is deeper than we thought. Cops, lawyers, even judges. They're all in on it. If anything happens to me, you know where to find the files. But be careful. Trust no one." I read the words over and over, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. Tom had known about the extent of the corruption, had been building a case against the cartel from the inside, and he'd kept it all hidden from me, even as he dragged me into his doomed operation. Mason leaned closer, his expression dark. "This isn't just about the cartel, David. It's about the people in our own backyard. People who sold out to protect their own interests. No wonder they wanted Tom out of the picture." Rachel's face went pale as she read over my shoulder. "He was going to expose them all. That's why they killed him. He must have thought he could use the files as leverage." I felt a surge of anger and grief twist inside me, thinking of the friend I'd lost, the partner who'd kept me in the dark until it was too late. But before I could process it, Mason pulled up an audio recording from the flash drive. He pressed play, and Tom's voice filled the cabin, rough and urgent. "Dario, listen to me. If anything happens, you need to reach out to Rachel. She's got the contacts. And David, he's the only one who can make this right. But don't trust anyone else, you hear me? Not even the ones on our side. The recording cut off, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. I turned to Rachel, my mind racing. You knew about this. You knew Tom was using you as a backup plan. She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't, I swear. I thought he was just trying to keep me out of danger. But as she spoke, I saw the flicker of guilt in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she held the logbook. And I knew, deep down, that there was still more she wasn't telling me. Before I could press her further, Mason's phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "We've got company," he said, his voice tense. "Marco's men. They must have tracked us here." I cursed under my breath, grabbing the gun from my jacket and checking the ammunition. "How many?" Mason peered out the window, his face set in grim determination. "3, maybe 4. Armed. They're moving in from the east side." Rachel's face went pale, and she clutched my arm. "David, we can't fight them. We have to run." I shook her off, keeping my voice low and focused. "No more running. If we don't take a stand now, we'll never get out of this alive." I turned back to Mason, who was already setting up a defensive position near the back window. But as I moved to join him, I noticed something strange. A folder on his laptop labeled with my name, containing surveillance photos of me, Rachel, and Dario. My blood ran cold as I realized the implications. I grabbed Mason by the collar, yanking him around to face me. "What the hell is this, Mason? You've been tracking us?" He sneered, his eyes flashing with something cold and ruthless. "You think I helped you out of the kindness of my heart, David? I've been watching you ever since you came crawling back to town. The broker pays well for information, and you've been a gold mine." Rachel gasped, backing away, but Mason kept his eyes on me, his smile widening. "I gave you just enough to keep you digging, just enough to make sure you bring me the files. And now you're going to hand them over, if you want to get out of here alive." I felt a surge of betrayal twist inside me, but before I could respond, the sound of footsteps on the porch reached us. Mason's head jerked toward the noise, and I took the chance to lunge at him, knocking the gun from his hand. We struggled on the floor, but Mason was strong, his grip like iron. Rachel grabbed the gun I dropped and aimed it at Mason, her hands shaking. "Stop it, both of you. We have to work together. If we don't, we're all dead." Mason laughed, even as I struggled to pin him down. "You think you can trust him, Rachel? He'll turn on you the first chance he gets. Just like Tom." Before she could respond, the front door burst open, and one of Marco's men stormed in, gun raised. I threw myself to the side as he fired, the bullet splintering the wood next to my head. Mason rolled away, grabbing his gun and returning fire, but another man rushed in from the back, pinning Rachel against the wall. Chaos erupted in the small cabin, the air filled with the crack of gunfire and the smell of cordite. I managed to grab my gun and take down the man holding Rachel, but not before he landed a hard blow to my side, sending me staggering back. Mason got the drop on the last of Marco's men, taking him out with a shot to the head. But as the man crumpled to the floor, I turned to see Mason aiming his gun at me, his eyes wild with desperation. "Hand over the flash drive, David. Last chance." I gritted my teeth, raising my weapon to meet his. Not a chance. Rachel moved between us, her hands up, her voice shaking. "David, please don't do this. We can find another way." But Mason snarled, pulling the trigger before she could finish. The shot rang out, and Rachel crumpled to the floor, blood spreading across her chest. Time seemed to slow as I saw her fall, her eyes wide with shock, her hand reaching for mine. I felt a roar of rage rise up inside me, and I turned on Mason, firing twice into his chest before he could react. He staggered, his mouth twisting into a final, bitter smile, and then he collapsed beside her. I dropped to my knees beside Rachel, pressing my hand against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her skin cold beneath my touch. "David, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want it to end like this. I wanted to survive." I felt the weight of her words settle over me, the flash drive burning a hole in my pocket. I knew that if I didn't move fast, more men would come, Marco's backup, or the broker's enforcers, eager to clean up the mess we'd made. I grabbed the flash drive and slipped it into her hand, meeting her gaze one last time. "You're going to be all right, Rachel, but I need you to hold on." She tried to smile, but the light was already fading from her eyes. "It's too late for me, David. Just promise me you'll finish what Tom started." I squeezed her hand, feeling the blood slick against my fingers, and nodded. "I promise." And then, as the last breath left her body, I knew that the final reckoning was at hand, and that I would have to face the broker alone. The cold wind whipped through the trees as I stood over Rachel's body, her blood staining the floorboards of Mason's cabin. Her eyes stared up at nothing, her final words echoing in my mind. "Promise me you'll finish what Tom started." I knew that there was no turning back now, only a path forward, one that led straight into the heart of darkness. I searched Mason's body, finding his phone and a crumpled note with coordinates scribbled on it, the broker's location. He'd been playing both sides, trying to profit from every angle, but now I had the edge. I pocketed the note and took one last look at Rachel, feeling the weight of loss press down on my chest. Then I turned away, slipping into the darkness and leaving the cabin behind. I drove through the back roads with my headlights off, following the coordinates Mason had left. The flash drive felt heavy in my pocket, holding the key to unraveling the cartel's operations and the crooked network that had kept them safe. But I knew that getting to the broker would be the hard part. He'd have expected Mason's betrayal, and he'd be ready for me. The coordinates led to an abandoned factory near the old river docks, a place where rusted cranes loomed over the water like forgotten giants. I parked a block away, pulling my gun from the glove compartment and checking the ammunition. The night was quiet, but I could feel the tension buzzing in the air, the sense that I was walking into a trap. As I approached the factory, I saw a light flickering inside, casting long shadows across the broken windows. I moved quietly, slipping through a side entrance, my gun at the ready. My boots crunched on broken glass, each step echoing through the empty halls. In the center of the factory floor, beneath the glow of a single hanging bulb, stood a man in a tailored suit, his face hidden in the shadows. He turned as I entered, revealing the scar that ran down his jawline, his smile sharp and predatory. "David," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "I wondered how long it would take you to find me. You've caused quite a mess, you know, but it's good to see you're still as stubborn as ever." I kept my gun aimed at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're the broker." He spread his hands, as if welcoming the accusation. "It's a name, nothing more. A role, if you will. But yes, I'm the one who's been watching you since the beginning. You and Tom, both so eager to play the heroes." I gritted my teeth, taking a step closer. "This ends tonight. I've got enough evidence on this drive to put you and your entire network behind bars." The broker's smile widened. "Do you now? And what makes you think you'll live long enough to see that through?" Before I could react, a figure stepped out of the shadows behind me, a man with a pistol aimed at the back of my head. I tensed, cursing myself for not spotting him sooner, but the broker only chuckled. "You see, David, I know you. You never quite learned when to trust the wrong people, or when to trust the right ones." Mason was useful, but predictable. And Rachel, well, she was always a liability, wasn't she? His words cut deep, stirring the anger and guilt that had been simmering inside me. "You manipulated all of us, made us think we had a choice." "Did I?" The broker tilted his head, his expression turning cold. "Or did you play right into my hands, just like Tom did? He thought he could outsmart me too. And look where that got him." I glanced toward the enforcer behind me, weighing my options. I could hear the mocking lilt in the broker's voice, the confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. But he didn't know what I'd learned from Tom's files, or the hidden backup I'd sent to Mia earlier that night. I forced a grim smile, gripping the flash drive in my pocket. "You think I didn't come prepared, broker? The drive is already with the authorities. Your time's up." For the first time, the broker's composure faltered, his smile fading. He glanced at the enforcer, and I took my chance, driving my elbow back into the man's gut. He grunted, stumbling, and I twisted around, firing a shot into his shoulder before he could recover. The broker pulled a gun from his jacket, but I was faster, closing the distance between us and knocking the weapon from his hand. We struggled, grappling on the concrete floor, his fists landing hard against my ribs. But I didn't let go, slamming him back against a rusted support beam, pinning him there with my forearm. Tom didn't deserve to die for your games, I snarled, my grip tightening around his throat. And neither did Rachel. The broker coughed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, but he managed a bitter smile. You think you're different from me, David? You think exposing my operation will bring you peace? I pressed harder, my vision swimming with rage. I'm not doing this for peace. I'm doing it for them. With a final shove, I slammed him into the beam, hearing the crunch of bone. He crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath, but I kept my gun trained on him, my finger hovering over the trigger. For a moment, the air hung heavy with the possibility of ending it all right there. One pull of the trigger, and I could be done with him forever. But as I looked down at the broker, at the man who had twisted our lives into knots, I felt the weight of every decision I'd made, every choice that had led me to this moment. I thought about Tom's last message, about the files he'd hidden and the secrets he'd tried to reveal. I thought about Rachel, dying in my arms, begging me to finish what he'd started. And I realized that taking this man's life wouldn't undo the damage. It wouldn't bring them back. I lowered the gun, my breath coming out in a ragged sigh. No, I'm going to let the law handle you, the way Tom would have wanted. The broker's laugh was weak, mocking. You think they'll keep me locked up? I have friends everywhere. You've only delayed the inevitable. I ignored him, pulling out my phone and dialing Mia's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice crackling through the static. David, are you all right? I've got him, I said, glancing at the broker's broken form. Get the authorities down here. It's over. The police arrived within minutes, swarming the factory with flashing lights and barking orders. They cuffed the broker and loaded him into the back of a squad car, his smile never wavering as he disappeared into the darkness. I watched him go, feeling the weight of the past 2 years settle over my shoulders. Mia found me standing outside, her expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. You did it, David. You brought him down. I nodded, but the words felt hollow. Yeah, but it cost us everything. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her voice softening. Rachel, she made her choices. So did you. But Tom's legacy, it's safe now. You made sure of that. I glanced toward the rising sun, the first light cutting through the mist over the river. I thought about the promises I'd made, the ghosts I'd tried to lay to rest, and I wondered if the truth had really been worth the price. Maybe, I said quietly, but it doesn't feel like a victory. Mia squeezed my shoulder, then turned to leave, disappearing into the swarm of police cars. I stayed behind, staring out at the river, the water catching the dawn's light. And as I stood there, alone with the echoes of the past, I realized that some battles don't have winners, only survivors.